Her stepsister pushed her from the cliff path, but the Duke of Camberly was there to catch her. I have told the story of Alara Voss so many times now, to my wife, to the fire, to anyone who will sit still long enough, that I sometimes think I dreamed it. I did not dream it. I was standing 20 feet away when it happened, and I have carried every detail of that afternoon in my memory the way a man carries a scar he is glad to have. Proof that something real occurred, proof that the world sometimes corrects itself with startling speed. My name is Aldous Renwick. I have been the Duke of Camberley's closest friend for 19 years, since we were both young men too proud to admit we needed anyone. In all those years I have watched Gideon Ashford, and Gideon is the Duke of Camberley, though I will call him Gideon here, because that is what he is to me. I have watched him be feared, admired, avoided, and occasionally loathed. I have watched him hold a room into silence by entering it. I have watched him refuse to dance with a marchioness because her husband had once spoken badly of a servant, and then stand perfectly still while the entire assembly processed what had just happened. I have watched him be ruthless in business, generous in private, and utterly impenetrable at the surface. I had never watched him afraid. Not until the afternoon of the cliff path. It was the last week of August, and Gideon had opened Camberley Hall to a house party of 30 souls, a thing he did once a year, with the resigned efficiency of a general organizing a campaign he knows is necessary but does not enjoy. The estate sat at the top of a long chalk headland, and on a clear day you could see the shipping lanes from the upper terrace. On a less clear day, which that week mostly was, you could see nothing but gray water and the wheeling of seabirds, which Gideon seemed to prefer. The guests arrived in the usual formation: titled men and their ambitious wives, younger sons calculating their prospects, daughters deployed like chess pieces toward the most powerful available square. Gideon moved through them with the practiced courtesy of a man who has long since learned to inhabit social spaces without being changed by them. He was polite. He was never warm. Alara Voss arrived with her stepfamily. I noticed her because she was the only person in the party who seemed genuinely pleased by the seabirds. She was standing at the edge of the upper terrace on the first evening while the others arranged themselves in the drawing room with their competition and their laughter, and she was watching a pair of gannets drop like white stones into the gray water below. Her expression was the expression of someone who has just witnessed something entirely satisfying. When she noticed me watching her, she looked briefly embarrassed, as though she had been caught doing something that required apology. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I know I ought to be inside." "There is no law requiring it," I told her, "though I suspect there are people in there who would prefer you felt that there was." She smiled at that, a quick, private smile, as though she were keeping it from someone who might take it from her, and then she turned back to the water. That was my first meeting with Alara Voss. I did not know, at the time, that I was watching a woman who would be pushed off a cliff in 72 hours. I did not know that within a week she would be the most talked-of woman in 3 counties. What I knew, standing on that terrace in the last of the August light, was that she was the most at-ease person who had arrived at Camberley Hall in several years, and that this somehow made her look entirely out of place. Her stepsister, Cecily Hartwell, was a different proposition entirely. Cecily had come to the house party with one purpose, so nakedly apparent that I marveled she had not simply announced it on the journey down. She was a beautiful woman, no one would have disputed that, with the kind of beauty that knows itself, and has decided to be useful. She had fixed on Gideon within approximately 20 minutes of arriving, and she spent the following 2 days deploying every instrument of feminine charm against him with the discipline of a military campaign. Gideon was courteous to her, as he was courteous to everyone. He was not, as far as I could observe, particularly moved. This did not please Cecily. I watched her watch Alara on the second evening, and I saw something shift in her expression, not anger precisely, but a calculation that was colder than anger. Alara had said something amusing to Gideon's steward, a quiet man named Poole who rarely smiled, and Poole had smiled, and Gideon, passing through the hallway, had paused to hear the end of it. He had not laughed, he had merely paused. But Cecily had seen the pause, and Cecily, I think, had understood it before anyone else did, including Gideon. The next morning she spoke to Alara over breakfast in a tone so sweetly poisonous that I had to concentrate on my eggs to stop myself from responding. She remarked that Alara's gown was charming, if one preferred the style of 3 seasons past. She observed that Alara's hair would benefit from the attention of a proper lady's maid rather than her own attempts. She suggested, with a smile so beautiful it ought to have been illegal, that Alara might want to spend the afternoon resting, as the social demands of a house party could be quite exhausting for those who were not accustomed to this sort of company. Alara said nothing. She drank her tea. Her hand was perfectly steady. That, I thought, was its own kind of courage. The cliff-top walk was proposed on the third afternoon, when a break in the clouds persuaded the company that fresh air and scenery were more interesting than whist. Gideon's headland path ran along the bluff from the hall's east terrace to a disused folly at the far end of the promontory, a walk of perhaps a mile and a half, with the chalk cliffs dropping away on the seaward side and gorse-covered downland rolling to the left. The path was wide enough for two people walking side by side, in most places, and in all places it was perfectly safe if you kept away from the crumbling outer edge. The company sorted itself, as companies do, into clusters and pairs, and began to stroll. I was walking perhaps 30 feet behind Alara and Cecily, in the company of a barrister named Fortescue, whose conversation was thorough if not scintillating. Gideon was ahead of us all, having walked the path to the folly and turned back, and was making his return when the incident occurred. Cecily and Alara were walking close to the outer edge of the path. I would learn later that Cecily had steered them there with the gentle insistence of someone who knows exactly what she is doing. What I saw in the moment was simple. Cecily turned to say something to Alara, and her hand came out, and Alara went over the edge. She did not fall. That is the thing I want you to understand, because it matters. She did not fall. The outer edge of the path crumbled where her foot came down, but below it, 4 feet below on a jut of chalk and root, there was a ledge. She landed on it, hard enough to knock the breath from her, I would learn later, hard enough to split her palm on the rock. But she did not go down the cliff face. She landed on the ledge and she grabbed at the chalk and she held. For a moment that stretched beyond ordinary time, no one on the path moved. Cecily stood at the path's edge and looked down, and her expression, I saw it clearly because I was close enough, and because I was looking at her and not at the drop, her expression was not horror. It was assessment. Gideon was there before I had fully registered what had happened. I do not know how he moved so quickly. He had been 30 yards away, walking in the other direction, and then he was at the edge, and then he was over it, and then he was descending. Not falling, descending, with the controlled urgency of a man who has decided that the drop is an obstacle and not a fact. He had his coat off by the time he reached the ledge, and I heard his voice before I could make out the words, low and steady, the voice you use with a frightened animal or a soldier in extremity, the voice that says, I am here and I will not leave. I had made it to the edge by then, with Fortescue behind me, and I looked over. Alara was on the ledge, one hand braced against the chalk face, and Gideon was crouched beside her, and he had his hands on her, her arms, her shoulders, checking her with the rapid efficiency of someone who has had occasion to tend to the injured before. I watched him find the cut on her palm, and I watched his jaw set in a way I have never seen it set before or since. Not at the cut. At something he had already decided about the origin of the cut. Can you move? He said to her. Yes, she said. She was pale. She was, and this is the thing I cannot make anyone understand who did not see it, she was composed. She was sitting on a 4-foot chalk ledge 40 feet above a rocky shore, bleeding from her hand, and she was composed. She looked, if anything, annoyed at herself for having gone over. You did not go over on your own, Gideon said. It was not a question. A pause. The edge gave way, Alara said carefully. Gideon looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man hearing a careful answer to a direct question, and understanding exactly what the care means. The edge gave way, he repeated. Yes. He helped her up. He put his arm around her with such decisive steadiness that she had no real option but to lean into it, and he brought her up the cliff face with the same controlled economy he had used going down. When they reached the path, he did not release her. The assembled company had gathered. 30 people, standing in a loose and horrified crescent on the path, and Cecily among them. And Cecily's expression had by now resolved itself into the correctly horrified and trembling thing it ought to have been from the beginning. My poor darling, Cecily said, moving forward. Alara, what a dreadful accident. You will stay where you are, Gideon said. The path went quiet. Even the seabirds seemed to subtract themselves from the moment. Cecily stopped. There is a particular quality to Gideon's voice when he has made a decision. It is not raised. It is not harsh. It is simply final in the way that the closing of a heavy door is final, and it fills whatever space it occupies so completely that no other sound seems possible. I had heard it in courtrooms, in counting houses, in the drawing rooms of men who had made serious mistakes and were about to find out what that meant. I had never heard it directed at a woman on a clifftop path. "I was watching," Gideon said to Cecily. He looked at her with the full, unsparing attention he almost never deployed in public, because he understood that his attention was a thing people felt. "I was on the path, and I was facing this direction, and I watched your hand come out." Cecily drew a breath. "Your Grace, I don't know what you think you saw." "I know what I saw," Gideon said. "And there are 30 people standing on this path who will now be weighing what I have just said against what they know of you, and what they know of this young woman beside me, and what they observed of your behavior toward her in the past 3 days." He did not look at the 30 people. He did not need to. The 30 people were doing exactly what he described, and several of them were doing it with the expression of people who had already reached a conclusion and were only now admitting it. "We are going back to the hall," Gideon said. He turned to Alara, and his voice changed, not softer exactly, but different in quality, the way a flame changes quality from scorching to warming. "Can you walk?" "I can walk," Alara said. "Then take my arm." She took his arm. He walked her back along the path, and the company fell in around them, and Cecily was left at the rear, and not one person offered to walk beside her. The hall's physician was sent for, and Alara's hand was attended to in the blue sitting room, and Gideon sat in the chair beside her throughout in a way that permitted no discussion about whether he ought to be there. I stationed myself near the door, which is where I have always been most useful, close enough to observe, far enough to give the principals room. Alara was calmer than anyone had a right to be. She submitted to the physician's attention, she answered his questions, and when he had gone she sat with her bandaged hand in her lap and looked at the window for a long moment. "You should not have said it in front of everyone," she said to Gideon. "I said what was true." "Cecily will," she stopped. "It will cause a great deal of difficulty." "For Cecily," Gideon said, "not for you. Your Grace, you do not know my family. My stepmother will present it as she will find a way to make it seem that I—" "Miss Voss," Gideon said, and something in his voice brought her eyes to his, and she stopped speaking. "I am the Duke of Camberly. Your stepmother can present it in any terms she chooses. The terms in which it will be received are mine to determine." Alara looked at him with an expression I could not immediately parse. It was not gratitude, though there was gratitude in it. It was not surprise, though there was something adjacent to surprise. It was the expression, I thought, of someone hearing a thing they have wanted to believe for a long time, and deciding carefully whether to let themselves. "Why," she said finally, it was a very small word. She made it sound almost apologetic. Gideon was quiet for long enough that the silence changed in quality. "Because," he said, "I have been watching you since the evening you stood on my terrace and observed that there was no law requiring you to stand indoors. And because there are very few people who have ever stood in a room I occupied and found the seabirds more interesting. And because the way you spoke to Poole—" He stopped. He looked briefly like a man who has said more than he intended. Then he decided, it seemed, to continue. "Because you have more dignity than anyone in that house party, and I have been watching them try to take it from you since you arrived, and I will not watch them take the rest." Alara was silent. "That is a great deal of reasons," she said at last. "It is a complicated situation," Gideon said. And for the first time since she had gone over the edge of the cliff, color came back into her face, not from shock, but from something warmer, something quietly illuminating. She looked down at her bandaged hand, and then she looked back at him, and whatever she was calculating seemed to resolve itself. "I should like," she said, "to remain on your terrace again tomorrow morning, if the seabirds oblige." "I will arrange for the seabirds," Gideon said. And something moved at the corner of his mouth that I had not seen move in a very long time. "I should tell you about the evening, because the evening was important." Gideon rejoined the assembled company at dinner with the expression of a man who has decided what the rules of the evening are going to be, and the assembled company understood this and conducted itself accordingly. Cecily was present. Her stepmother was present. They sat together at the far end of the table and spoke to each other in undertones and ate very little, and no one near them introduced any conversational topics. because no one near them wished to be associated with what everyone near them was thinking. Elara came down to dinner. This was not expected. I had anticipated that she would keep to her rooms, and so had Cecily, if her expression when Elara appeared in the doorway was any indication. And she came down in a gown the color of sea mist, with her bandaged hand held with perfect naturalness at her side, and she went to her place at the table without any particular ceremony. Gideon stood when she entered. Gideon never stood when anyone entered. He had been a duke for 16 years, and the proprieties of the table had long since arranged themselves around his preferences, and one of those preferences was that he acknowledged arrivals with a nod. He stood for Elara Voss. He stood and he held her chair himself, bypassing Poole, and he said something to her too quiet for the table to hear. Whatever he said made her glance at him sideways with the quick private smile I had seen on the terrace on the first evening. The table watched all of this. The table had been watching Gideon Ashford for years without seeing him do anything like this, and the table was reevaluating everything it thought it knew, and reevaluating it quite fast. Cecily went white. Her stepmother put down her fork. Gideon returned to his end of the table, poured his wine, and addressed the nearest conversation with the complete tranquility of a man who has done nothing out of the ordinary. I caught his eye once during the fish course, and he held my gaze for a moment with the expression he uses when he has made an irreversible decision and is comfortable with it, and then we both went back to our dinners. What happened in the following days was not, at its core, complicated. Cecily and her stepmother left Camberly Hall the following morning in the quietly expedited manner of people who have been made to understand that their departure would be welcome. Several letters were exchanged. Gideon's solicitor became involved in the question of a certain financial arrangement that the Hartwell family had maintained at Elara's expense since her father's death, the details of which I will not recount here, not least because they were sufficiently outrageous that repeating them still raises my blood pressure. And those arrangements were resolved with the finality that tends to attend matters that come under Gideon's attention. None of this was made public. It did not need to be. What was made public, though made public slowly, the way significant things tend to be, through observation rather than announcement, was the fact that the Duke of Camberly was conducting a courtship. He was not subtle about it. He was not the sort of man who made a practice of subtlety when he had decided on a direction. He called at Elara's lodgings in the village with the regularity of a tide and the implacability of one. He sent books. He had discovered in those house party days that she read widely and had been denied the means to do so as freely as she wished, and she sent back, tucked inside the books, opinions. He introduced her to his steward, his housekeeper, the household of Camberly Hall in all its working particularity, and she moved through all of it with the same quality that had caught his attention on the terrace. She was genuinely interested in the gannets, and the seabirds, and Poole's collection of sea charts, and the old walled kitchen garden, and the way the chalk cliffs changed color in different lights. She was, in short, interested in Camberly itself, not in what Camberly represented, not in the weight of its name, but in the actual land and light and specific life of it. I think that was, for Gideon, the thing that finally broke the last of whatever reserve he still maintained. He had spent 16 years watching people be interested in what he represented. He had never had anyone be interested in what he actually was. I was present 6 weeks after the cliff path when he asked her. He did not make a ceremony of it. This was Gideon. He asked her on the east terrace in the early morning, with the seabirds doing exactly what seabirds do and the gray water running all the way to the shipping lanes, and he said what he had apparently been working toward since the moment he went over that cliff edge after her. And he said it simply, without ornamentation. In the direct way, he said all the things that mattered. I was at the far end of the terrace, engaged with some papers, and I did not hear the exact words. I heard the silence before them. I heard the seabirds. Then I heard Elara say something short and clear, and Gideon made the sound of a man who has been holding his breath for 6 weeks and has now been given permission to exhale. They were married in the chapel at Camberly Hall on a bright October morning, with a small company of people who had been specifically chosen for the quality of their genuine feeling rather than their social consequence. I stood as Gideon's witness, which I had expected. What I had not expected was the moment, as Elara came down the chapel aisle, when Gideon, standing at the chancel with the composed, impenetrable expression he had worn at 10,000 formal occasions, simply stopped wearing it. He watched her walk toward him, and whatever he felt moved visibly across his face, and the people in the pews who had known him for years sat forward slightly, the way people do when they witness something they were not sure the world would allow. She reached him. He took her bandaged hand. The scar was still faint on her palm. It would always be faint, and held it, and something in the way he held it said everything about what the cliff path had meant, and what he had decided in the moment he went over the edge, and what he had been certain of every day since. The ceremony was brief and unhurried, the way the best ones are. At the breakfast afterward, Alara sat at the head of her own table in her own hall, and she looked, I want to be accurate about this, she looked as she had on the terrace on that first evening, watching the gannets drop into the gray sea. She looked like someone in the right place, finally, with no requirement to be anywhere else. Gideon sat beside her the entire morning. He did not speak to anyone else if he could help it. He refilled her glass himself when it was empty, and when a younger guest made some faintly impertinent remark about the brevity of the engagement, Gideon looked at the young man with the expression that had once emptied a room at a counting house, and the young man discovered that his remark needed no follow-up. At one point in the middle of the morning, when the conversations around them had filled in, and the noise of the room was high enough to cover it, Alara leaned toward Gideon and said something private and close to his ear. He turned to look at her. Whatever she had said, whatever it was, and I have speculated about it many times over the years and have never arrived at a satisfying answer. It made him take her unbandaged hand, under the table where the room could not see it, and hold it quietly for the rest of the breakfast. That is the thing I remember most when I remember that day. Not the ceremony, not the toasts, not the October light in the chapel windows. The look on Gideon Ashford's face, the most feared duke I have ever known, who went over a cliff-top after a woman because the world had not yet figured out that she was worth catching. That look, turned toward Alara Voss, who had become Alara Ashford, who had known all along what she was worth and only needed one person to agree. The seabirds were very good that morning, I recall. She said so afterward. She was right,